It was a Thursday in early September in Kenya's Amboseli Basin. Owen's team had received a report from the Eastern Monitoring Sector. A juvenile elephant had become entangled in old wire fencing left behind by a livestock operation that had vacated the area years earlier. The rescue took most of the afternoon. The wire had worked its way around the animal's left hind leg and tightened with every attempt to pull free, requiring patient, careful cutting with bolt croppers while two team members managed the calf's distress from a safe distance. They worked at the edge of a small clearing, 300 meters inside the eastern tree line. And they were not alone. Throughout the entire procedure, a loose group of perhaps a dozen elephants had gathered at the perimeter, adult cows and younger animals, standing in the particular alert stillness that elephants adopted when observing something outside their experience. Owen had noted it in his field log that evening herd members present as observers appeared calm, no intervention behavior, dispersed at dusk. He had thought nothing more of it. One of those observers had been a calf, 6 months old, approximately. Tangent gray, still showing the fine hair of a very young animal. It had stood slightly apart from the adults, closer to the clearing than any of the others, and it had watched the entire rescue from start to finish with the fixed, unblinking attention that young elephants brought to things they were trying to understand. Owen did not notice it specifically at the time. He was busy with the wire. 1 month later, at 5:17 on a Monday morning in October, the knocking began. He was still asleep when it started a sound that wove itself into his dreaming as something unremarkable before his mind caught its actual shape. Deliberate. Rhythmic. 3 beats. A pause. 3 beats again, coming from the direction of the door. He lay still in the dark and listened. No crashing. No splintering. Just that steady, patient percussion against the wood. Owen checked his watch. 5:17. He pulled on trousers and boots, crossed the single room of the station, and stood at the door with his hand on the handle. 8 years in this place had taught him not to open doors in the dark without a moment's assessment first. He listened. Nothing beyond the knocking itself, no footsteps, no breathing, no movement in the dry grass. He opened the door. The baby elephant was standing on the step with its trunk raised, the rounded tip hovering an inch from the wood where it had just been knocking. It was very young, 6 months at most, based on the fine hair still visible across the crown of its head and the slight unsteadiness with which it held its trunk. Its eyes were dark and clear, and it was looking directly at Owen with an attention that had nothing unfocused or accidental about it. They looked at each other in the gray pre-dawn light. Then the calf lowered its trunk, touched the back of Owen's hand very gently, and took 3 steps back from the door. It stopped. It looked at him. It took 3 more steps toward the tree line and stopped again. Owen understood the shape of the request immediately, even if he could not yet understand its content. He went back inside for his field kit medical bag. Radio, GPS unit, 2 liters of water. He came back out and stood on the step. "All right," he said. "Show me." The calf turned and walked toward the forest. Owen followed, logging his GPS position before the tree line closed around them. The calf moved faster than he expected, not running, but carrying the compressed urgency of an animal working against a deadline. Every 30 or 40 meters it would stop and turn to confirm he was still there before continuing. The bird sounds of the morning fell away as they went deeper into the forest. Something else rose to replace them, a low, resonant vibration that Owen felt in his chest before he was certain he was actually hearing it. He had encountered that sound twice before in 8 years of work. Both times it had meant the same thing: a large animal in serious trouble. The calf quickened its pace. Owen kept up. The clearing opened ahead, and at its center was the pit. 3 meters across. Close to 3 meters deep, the walls were reinforced with stones set in deliberate courses not built in an afternoon, but over days, by someone who knew where the elephants moved. A poacher's capture trap, camouflaged with cut branches so that the ground appeared solid until it was not. At the bottom, an adult female elephant lay on her side. One of the large-bodied cows Owen had been monitoring for 2 seasons. Her left foreleg was bent in a direction it was not built to go. The earthen walls around her were scored deep tusk channels, drag marks, the evidence of hours of effort to build a ramp that never held. She was still alive. The sound Owen had been hearing was hers, low and continuous. The vocalization of an animal that had moved past panic into something deeper and more exhausted than panic. The calf rushed to the edge and reached its trunk down. The cow lifted hers from the bottom. They touched tip to tip, and her voice shifted immediately into something quieter. Even here, even now. Owen knelt at the edge and assessed. 2 days in the pit, possibly 3. Dehydration visible in the dullness of her skin, the sunken quality around her eyes. Compound fracture in the foreleg. Walls too steep for any unassisted extraction. Around the pit, the calf had been working, small trenches near the upper edge shallow. Inadequate. The effort of an animal that understood what needed to happen but lacked the mass to make it happen. A trail of wet vegetation leading from a stream bed 30 meters east back to the pit's edge. The calf had been carrying water to its mother. And there was something else. A track in the dry soil, small round footprints running in a straight line from the pit's edge through the trees. Not wandering, not circling, a deliberate bearing, held without deviation. Owen had followed that track this morning without knowing it. He was standing at one end of it. His research station was at the other. He understood then. The calf at the perimeter of the wire rescue, 1 month ago standing closest to the clearing, watching everything. It had observed humans extract an elephant from a situation the elephant could not escape alone. It had kept that knowledge for 30 days, and when the same crisis arrived, its mother trapped. Its own efforts exhausted, it had traveled 2 kilometers through the dark to the one place it had seen the problem solved. Owen reached for his radio. He gave his GPS coordinates, described what he was looking at, and said what he needed: a crane unit, a surgical team, people who had done this before. The nearest qualified unit was at the old Tukai station. 6 hours minimum, given the access track. 6 hours. He ended the call and looked at the cow. Her breathing was too fast. He estimated 12 hours, perhaps less, before the situation passed the point of reversal. The calf touched his hand with its trunk the same light, deliberate contact it had made at his door. Owen had spent his career insisting on precise language for what animals did, resisting the pull toward interpretation. But the calf was not displaying the behaviors of a distressed animal. It was calm, watchful, present the bearing of something that has done what was available to it and is now waiting to learn whether it was enough. Owen sat down at the pit's edge and waited alongside it. The morning passed slowly. The cow drifted in and out of alertness, but whenever the calf reached its trunk down to her, she responded, trunk rising, voice dropping into that lower register, an animal anchoring itself to something it trusts. Owen had read about this, sitting 2 meters from it, in a clearing that smelled of stone and injured animals, was a different kind of knowing entirely. He worked the perimeter during the quieter intervals, photographing, measuring, building the record for the investigation that would follow. The trap was professionally constructed. Someone had studied the elephant's roots carefully. The documentation would matter. The calf moved with him as he worked. When he stopped, it stopped. When he moved, it came. At one point, he misjudged the ground near the pit's edge and stumbled, and the calf stepped immediately to his left and held its position there, not touching him, simply present until he steadied himself. He looked at the calf. The calf looked back with those quiet, attentive eyes. He wrote nothing about this in his field notes. He did not yet have the language for it. The rescue team arrived in the early afternoon, ahead of schedule. Dr. Nora Callahan, the Wildlife Service's senior field veterinarian for large mammal extraction, stepped out of the lead vehicle and walked directly to the pit's edge. She looked at the cow. She looked at the walls. She looked at the calf, standing at Owen's side. "That one found you?" she asked. Owen said yes. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already calculated. 40 minutes later, her team had the crane unit positioned on firm ground well back from the pit's edge. The extraction required partial sedation before any rigging could begin, enough to reduce the stress response without suppressing the cow's breathing. The fracture in her foreleg made the standard harness unusable. Nora's team built a modified sling that distributed the lifting load across the cow's chest and hindquarters, keeping the injured leg free. When the crane took the load and the cow began to rise, every person in the clearing went quiet. Nora stood with her hand on her radio and did not move. The cow rose slowly from the pit. She used her uninjured legs to steady herself as she came up, working with the lift, not against it. Owen had seen traumatized animals fight their own rescue. This was not that. Her feet found solid ground. The calf crossed the clearing before Owen registered it moving. It reached its trunk to its mother's face and moved along her jaw and down her neck, making sounds that had no formal classification in any of Owen's field notes, but that every person in that clearing understood without needing one. The cow lowered her head and rested her trunk across the calf's back. The clearing held that moment quietly. Then Nora cleared her throat and told her team to set up the surgical field. The fracture required external stabilization that could hold through the initial healing phase without human management. The cow was returning to her herd, and whatever was built had to work on its own. Nora moved with the focused economy of someone operating in the only mode available. Owen assisted with instruments and respiration monitoring. The calf stayed at its mother's head throughout. At one point, when the work reached the injured leg and the cow shifted hard against her sedation, a sudden lurch that made 2 team members step back. The calf pressed the flat of its trunk against its mother's cheek and held it there. The cow stilled within seconds. Her breathing slowed. Nora waited a beat, then continued without a word. By late afternoon, the cow was stable on 3 legs. The 4th supported, the stabilization holding. Nora radioed the herd monitoring team for a current position. The family was 5 kilometers northeast. They had been holding position for 3 days, exactly matching the mother's absence. They had not moved on. They had stayed. The reunion came at the forest's edge as the light flattened toward the tree line. The herd arrived quietly, the eldest first, the matriarch, and 2 large cows, moving with the authority of animals that had been making decisions for this family for a long time. They reached the injured cow and the calf and began the slow, thorough process of contact and examination, trunk to face. trunk to flank. Vocalizations at frequencies Owen felt in his sternum more than heard with his ears. The calf disappeared into the family immediately, touched and acknowledged by each adult in turn. Owen watched it fold back into the group, the particular relief of something that has been operating far beyond its range, finally returning to where it was made for. The matriarch completed the reunion and turned, with a deliberateness impossible to misread, toward where Owen stood at the clearing's edge. She stopped 2 meters from him. She extended her trunk and held it there, reading him slowly and completely in the way elephants read things without shortcuts, without rushing. After a long moment, she lowered her trunk. She held his gaze for several seconds in a way that Owen would try to describe in his field notes 3 separate times over the following week, crossing out each attempt before reaching the end of it. Then she turned and moved back toward her family. The herd began moving northeast, pacing themselves to the injured cow's walk. The calf was the last to leave. It separated from the group, walked back to where Owen was standing, and pressed its trunk gently against the side of his face. Owen raised his hand and rested it briefly on the calf's head. Then the calf turned and walked after its family, and the forest closed around them, and they were gone. Owen stood in the empty clearing while the rescue team loaded their equipment and drove off down the track. The pit was still open. The investigation into who had built it would run for months. There were things in this work that did not resolve cleanly, and he had learned to carry them. He walked back through the eucalyptus trees in the gathering dark. 2 kilometers. The same distance the calf had traveled the night before, in the other direction, through darkness, toward a door it had somehow known to knock on. It had remembered. It had reasoned. It had knocked until someone answered. Owen sat down at his field table and opened his research journal to a clean page. He wrote the date and the time. Outside, the night sounds of the Amboseli arrived in their familiar sequence, the night jars first. Then the low percussion of elephants moving northeast, a family going home through the dark at the pace of their slowest member. He picked up his pen and began to write. In the years that followed, Owen would encounter that family many times. The cow's leg healed with a slight permanent change to her gait. Visible on soft ground, she recovered her place in the herd and lived by every indication of full elephant life. The calf grew. Each time their paths crossed over the next 8 years, it would approach from whatever distance separated them and touch its trunk to Owen's hand the same light. Deliberate contact it had made at the door of his station on that October morning before the sun came up. Owen never tried to explain this to people who asked. He had the field notes careful, precise, stripped of interpretive excess. They described what had happened in the language available to him. But there were things that had happened in that clearing that the notes were not built to hold. At some point, he had stopped trying to fit them into the vocabulary of his discipline. Some mornings, when the elephant movement to the north was closer than usual, he would pause before starting the kettle and simply listen. And some mornings, in the quality of those low, distant vocalizations moving through the pre-dawn dark, he was almost certain he could still hear them.